right. Well, unlike all the rest of the speakers, I'm going to keep my mask on because of the vulnerability of my partner. Um, for those who don't know, for people who take immunosuppressive drugs, even if you're fully vaccinated, you may not be fully vaccinated. So, because Jan's in that category, I am continuing to take some pretty serious precautions. Um, so, just to review, 2 weeks ago, we talked about seasons as a concept, and the person I talked about was Pauline Murray, the Reverend Dr. Pauline Murray, who certainly went through some very intense seasons in her life, being, at one point a very famous lawyer, then becoming an activist in all sorts of different ways around trans issues, a family history and research pioneer, and then ultimately a priest. Last week, we talked about the value of seeing and being seen, and I talked about the Reverend Dr. Bishop Yvette Flunder and her entire concept of radical inclusion, which is ultimately about seeing everybody as being part of us and belonging together. And then today, appropriately enough, we're talking about journeys, particularly labyrinth journeys. So I'm going to say a few words about another personal hero of mine, the Reverend Elder Troy Perry, who is the founder of the Metropolitan Community Churches, which is the first and still only, LGBT-focused Christian denomination. Reverend Perry was born in July of 1940 in northern Florida. He was the son of a bootlegger and also had in his family Pentecostal preachers, which is an interesting combination. His aunts ran street services, and he felt called to preach from a very young age. His dad died fleeing the police when he was only 11, and he fled some abuse from his stepdad when he was, I think, only like about 16. He was preaching by 15 and was a licensed preacher shortly after that. But he was also figuring out that he was attracted to men. He married at 19 to try and fix that. Do I need to say that it didn't work? He had 2 sons, moved to Illinois to attend Moody Bible Institute, but they found out about him, and they had to relocate to LA to try and start over. In 1961, about that time, his wife found out that he still was not fixed when she discovered the copy of a then very famous queer book underneath his mattress. They split up. He ended up joining the army. He spent 2 years in Germany, returned to LA afterwards, got involved in a very serious relationship, and when that fell apart, he tried to commit suicide. On the other side of that suicide, having lived, he heard very clearly the call of God to get back into ministry and to minister to other people like himself. Nancy Wilson, who succeeded him as the head of the Metropolitan Community Churches, has often said that it is her sincere belief that Troy Perry was not the first person called to start an LGBT-focused church. He was just the first one who said yes. And again, he did this in 1968, a year before Stonewall. He put an ad in the Advocate magazine, which some of you may have heard of, that's still a very famous queer publication, inviting people to come to his home for a church service where they could be themselves. 9 of his friends and 3 other people showed up. That makes 12, a wonderfully biblical number with which to launch a church enterprise. And MCC was born. Now, I know there's some people in this group here who have a lot of experience with church planting. So I want you to think about these numbers, okay? They started with 12 people. 3 months later, they were too big for the living room, So they were in a 600-seat auditorium. 3 years later, they had over 1,000 members and their own building, and they had 8 satellite churches and were a denomination. They had churches in San Francisco, San Diego, Honolulu, Chicago, LA, and including all the things that were startups and not yet churches. By 1971, they had 19 full congregations. By 72, they had 35 congregations in 19 states. And by 78, they had 111 congregations, including ones in Canada, Great Britain, Nigeria, and Australia. Now, this is the time that we think of as the Great Jesus People Revival, okay, the late 60s to the early 70s. And I'm just making the point to you here that queer people were not left out of this revivalistic energy going on, not only as individuals, often closeted within those kind of churches, but as queer people in a denomination focused on queer people. Now, I'm only going to give a few highlights of the many things that he and MCC have done over the years that I really, again, same as before, I just want to whet your appetite to find out more about this. He began conducting same-gender, they couldn't call them marriage services, so within the history of MCC, they were always called holy unions. And if you know queer couples who are old enough who will tell you that they had 2 or 3 or 4 weddings, usually the first one was a holy union performed in an MCC somewhere. He began doing that in 1968. By 1971, he was fasting and praying and leading a march on the state capitol in Sacramento to get rid of the sodomy laws. MCC began ordaining women in 1972, and there's a whole story about that involving someone that, another one of my heroes, Frida Smith, that I'd love to tell you about sometime. And in 72, he actually felt compelled to write a book about all this. The Lord is my shepherd, and he knows I'm gay. If you really want to dig in to, where ministry to queer people and by queer people comes from in modern times, that's the book to start with. By 1977 and 78, when Anita Bryant was doing her anti-gay campaigns, and at that same time, Exodus, ex-gay ministries, attempts to repair people, so-called, were being formed. He began fasting and praying about stopping that. And that Briggs Initiative, which again came out of Orange County, that same place where, Exodus had been formed and stuff, to everyone's surprise, was stopped in California. That's the campaign that made Harvey Milk famous. But he was behind there doing that. Oh, and did I mention that back in 1970, he and 2 other people organized the first Pride Parade? Not just the first one in Los Angeles, the first one anywhere to commemorate Stonewall. Later in 1978, after Harvey Milk's assassination, when Jerry Falwell was tearing across the country organizing the moral majority, and people don't remember it now, but he first came to national prominence by supporting Anita Bryant and that whole crusade. Well, Jimmy Carter responded to that by calling something called the First White House Conference on the Family. And guess who showed up there to say, queer families are families too? Reverend Troy Perry and a whole phalanx of MCC ministers. Every March on Washington, the first one was after Milk's assassination. There was another one in, I think, 86, another one in 2000. At most of them, he performed mass marriages, one in front of the IRS building and one on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Through the 80s and 90s, like all other MCC preachers, he had to deal with AIDS, with the constant loss, and the constant civil rights battles about would partners be allowed to be in their partners' hospital rooms? Would they be allowed to make decisions? AIDS hit quickly. People didn't have advance directives in places. So he became a civil rights pioneer about all those things. In 1995, he visited the Clintons in the White House in their first conference about HIV and AIDS in 1997. He was back again to talk about hate crimes and that queer community had to be included in hate crimes. And I could go on about firsts in trans things, ordaining trans people, and firsts in things like that would still be called controversial, like recognizing people in polyamorous marriages and ordaining those people too. Today, MCC has 222 congregations in 37 countries, and is known all over the world as the social justice church, which is not a bad thing to be remembered as. And I just want to say one final thing, sort of in summary about Pride Month. The three people that I've told you about here, Polly Murray, Bishop Flunder, and Reverend Elder Perry, are all people who I personally consider to be saints. In the U.S., we have this habit, and in a lot of places, of referring to all Christians as saints. And that's valid. But the thing that I think makes people get remembered historically as saints isn't just the fact that they were Christian, and isn't usually what that word kind of means in the common parlance, which is, somebody who's particularly holy or particularly righteous. These were not people who lived uneventful or unproblematic lives. These are not people who didn't sometimes do problematic things. What they're remembered for is partially their gifts, but more importantly, how they used them along their journeys. If you want to be remembered as a saint, you can't just be using what God gave you just to benefit you. These people were remembered because they did things for whole communities that changed things not just for them, but for much larger us's. So my prayer for us this Pride Month, as we walk our labyrinths and reflect on our seasons and reflect on supporting each other in our calls and gifts, is that we would remember, in the midst of an America that too often has been focused on me and I and individual this, that if there's anything we've learned in this pandemic, it's that we have to be focused on us, and we have to use our gifts to benefit us. God be with you this Pride. Thank you.